happy to welcome Ruba Katrib, curator at MoMA PS1 and former curator at the SculptureCentre, and she'll be in conversation with José Esparza Chong Cuy, curator of New Proposals. Thank you guys for taking part of the Conversations program.
Gracias, Diego. Gracias a todos por venir. Yo soy José Esparza Chong Cuy. Como me presentó Diego, soy el curador invitado este año de la sección de Nuevas Propuestas, que es el pasillo al fondo por allá para que se dé una vuelta. Y como parte de esto, estoy feliz de poder tener aquí a Ruba Katrib de MoMA PS1, que es una curadora cuyo trabajo he seguido durante mucho tiempo. Not only I'm going to switch to English, whose work I've been following for quite some time, not only at the sculpture at PS1, but also, as it was mentioned, at the SculptureCentre in New York, which is only a few blocks away from PS1. And I love it. I thought it would be a great idea to have Ruba here in town for these days to visit the fair and to hear about her work, and also maybe even a bit about that transition from one kind of iconic art space in Long Island, in Queens, in New York, to another kind of iconic art space in New York. And there's something quite interesting about these two institutions that somehow are a product of similar spirits, of these kind of like independent spaces. PS1 was then kind of with MoMA support, it became this kind of other institution, but it would be also fantastic to hear maybe even a little bit about the history of PS1 and a little bit about the history at the SculptureCentre, and maybe through some of the exhibitions that you've done. I thought it would just be great to hear some of Ruba's thoughts and her input on exhibition making. Last year I got a chance to see, I think it was your last show at the SculptureCentre, the 74 million tons, which was co-curated with artist Lawrence Abu Hamzam, one of the best shows I saw last year, so maybe she can also speak a little bit about that. Another fantastic exhibition that I saw last year, I was lucky enough to be able to see, was Site Santa Fe, the biennial in Santa Fe, which was called Casa Tomada and was co-curated with José Luis Blondet, who's also speaking here tomorrow, and Candice Hopkins. And Naomi Beckwith was a curatorial advisor who is also here and speaking tomorrow. I didn't even realize that I had invited these kind of three curators that were involved with the Site Santa Fe biennial. But maybe I'll pass it on to Ruba and we can hear a little bit about her shows and about the institutions where she works at. And then it's going to be quite informal. We'll open it up later for kind of a brief conversation and take some questions from the audience as well.
Thank you, Jose, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. So, upon the invitation to talk about curating inside and outside of the institution, which is quite a huge subject, I took the opportunity to reflect upon some of the shows I've worked on over the last 10 years, just to sort of take a through line, perhaps. And I put together some images that are sort of just a selection of shows. Not all of them, but just maybe to show a little bit of where... Well, they could almost be running like on a loop, but so there we go. Okay, you pointed there. Thank you. Okay, so I was thinking back to, I've been very fortunate to work in institutions in which artists are the center of the institution, experimentation is the center of the institution, new production is a central point of the institution, working with emerging artists, established artists. So these experiences have formed me as a curator, and I started working at MoCA in Miami in 2007, actually. And I started as an associate curator, and I organized several group exhibitions and a couple solo exhibitions. Corey Archangel's first retrospective, mid-career retrospective, and then the first and only museum retrospective of Clairefontaine, an artist collective that were based in Paris, now in Italy. And I was thinking back on this show because I think it does inform so many of the exhibitions and artists that I work with now. This exhibition was mostly new production, some existing works. Clairefontaine was a collective that was showing in many group exhibitions, very small solo shows, art fairs, and I, as a younger curator, wanted to give them the opportunity to take 7,000 square feet and make a show. And this was quite a feat for them. Most of their work was small, invisible, inserted into various contexts. So to take a space in its entirety and transform it. And they sort of unpeeled the institution in many ways. This object to the right is a vacuum cleaner that sucks the energy from this gas meter in order to affect the reading of the meter, so in order to cheat the meter. So the show is called Economies, and that was a central running theme throughout the show. Economies of labor, emotion. There was a room of tennis balls that were stuffed with various objects that was inspired by tennis balls that would be thrown into prison yards with various daily needs like toothpaste, tampons, drugs, etc. So this was a really important experience for me to work so closely with these artists to come up with a show that really tested their practice. Oops. Back to the beginning. And then in 2012, I went to the SculptureCentre, where I was curator from 2012 to basically 2017, 18. It was a soft, slow ending because I did finish a few shows there. This was my first exhibition at SculptureCentre, and you can see the artist list here. And this was the first institutional show, or really show ever, of some of these artists, like Ian Chang's first institutional show, Camille Henro, her first time ever showing in the US, with these tar-covered sculptures in the middle of the space, which actually was later acquired by the Museum of Modern Art. And this was an exhibition that was really investigating material. So some of the things I was thinking about working at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Miami, in which a lot of the artist-centered approach was about also innovating to produce new work, that was something that I really was interested in at a place called SculptureCentre, where sculpture is at the forefront and thinking of materiality and really thinking of the politics of materiality. So, so that's something that Clairefontaine definitely really raises in their work, and that was something that I've sort of taken through. And thinking through translatability of materials, the where do materials come from? Where do they go? What do they mean? What happens when we take them, the materials, as part of the content of the work? So that was sort of a formative experience as well.
But maybe before you move on with other SculptureCentre exhibitions, I think, I'm not sure if the audience is very familiar with the history of the SculptureCentre or actually with this institution. So perhaps it'd be nice to say a couple of things about how this institution was formed and how it's kind of changed over the years, and hear a little bit of, just to contextualize a little bit before you move on to other exhibitions and PS1.
So SculptureCentre was founded in the 1920s. It is the oldest artist-run space, or it's not really artist-run, but artist-led space in New York. And it was started as a clay club, and it was really like a workshop of sculptors making objects together. And so it went through many transformations throughout the years, and then in the early 2000s moved from a carriage house in in the Upper East Side to a building in Long Island City, which is this like Kunsthalle space. It's an old trolley repair, so it's also a unique space, and also MoMA PS1, where I work now, is also a unique space, a former school. So it's really also has been very interesting to work in these idiosyncratic buildings, or buildings that are not built to be museums initially, but built to be other things, and then have turned into institutions. So that's also very interesting in terms of working through space. And even MoCA in Miami, the space was it's a Charles Gwathmey building, but it's this huge airplane hangar-like space, very flexible, so you really have to build it out. And it was really interesting to work there because there was sort of limitless potential in terms of what you could do in a space. So but SculptureCentre has really become, it's a contemporary art institution that takes sculpture as a guiding principle. So it's not only sculpture being shown, but there's certain ideas around object making that are central to the exhibitions. And that was something as I worked there for 6 years with the director, really helped to formulate a concept of sculpture of the institution, how to be on the forefront of conversations of contemporary art in relation to sculpture, which I think still think is really a very important medium, because something I still really work with a lot because of the politics of space and how it engages with the politics of space, even if it's absent. So.
Yeah, I think that concept of materiality and the politics of materiality is quite interesting in the reading of a place like the SculptureCentre. And Jumana Mana's work somehow fits quite brilliantly into that as well.
Absolutely. This was this was a smaller solo show at SculptureCentre. Jumana Mana, her first show in the U.S. So a lot of these like first shows in the U.S., which was, really amazing in these institutions where you can take the plunge on artists, and that's something I really enjoy doing through group shows, but also solo shows. Like who can you give a solo show to? What is that opportunity? How do you support an artist? So Jumana Mana made these works on site for the most part. So I was very economical in the images, so I'm putting like one image per show, but there's a whole other side of the space. So she was working on site with concrete. She had an assistant, a friend, come help her. So it was really exciting to build something literally in the space for the space. And she combined it with this older video of hers that she hadn't really considered in some time. So it was a way to rethink her practice and also merge her video practice with her sculpture making.
Maybe I think she's a fascinating artist that I think that also maybe some of the audience doesn't know about her practice, so maybe
Yes.
it could also be.
So Jumana Mana is a Palestinian artist who is in her early 30s. She started making videos and films, and this film that is one of her first that you're seeing a little still of, Blessed Oblivion. And this is a film where she travels around with these macho guys in East Jerusalem. As they work out, they go to the salon, they drive their cars, they get their cars washed, they talk about petty crime and like sexual activity. And she's this, woman who's going around with them and kind of provoking them and instigating a little bit. And they're in East Jerusalem. And it's really like this expression of extreme masculinity and ownership in a place that is compromised, and in which they're also being pushed out of in many ways, and their homes are changing, their spaces are changing. And so that relates to the objects, because she's reproducing these porches in Silwan, which is a historic part of the neighborhood where the porches are falling apart. And it's this like Jerusalem limestone. They're this historic material and architectural structures, because there's an archaeological dig happening to find an old site, old like biblical site. So this is putting trying to discover and preserve this one history is in fact disrupting another living history. So this is part of the tension in her work that she's exploring. So it was really interesting for her to combine these things, and she's continued to do so, combine her moving image work with her sculptural work. Do you want me to show another picture? Let's see what's next. Okay, I think it's this one. We can keep going if you don't want to.
Whichever exhibitions you want to talk about.
I know, I kind of wanted it to cycle through, but maybe I can mention something like this.
Yeah.
Or, well, yeah, this is a solo show I did of an artist, Arya Rasmussen, a Thai artist. She's been shown in every major biennial exhibition internationally for the most part, but she also was someone who hadn't really been shown in the U.S., hadn't had a solo show in the U.S., hadn't had a retrospective. So this was a really exciting project for me to work on, and it was the entire ground floor of SculptureCentre, and her work is really, it was a lot of video. So again, that was another issue with the SculptureCentre thing, but she made these little vials filled with dog hair because she has all these dogs. So there were portraits of the dogs that she takes care of. And this show was interesting for me at a time in which there were a lot of conversations about post-humanism, animism, new materiality. And here's this artist, Arya Rasmussen. She's a Thai artist living in Chiang Mai, who was doing this really interesting work, a lot of video where she's sitting with corpses. So she's meditating with corpses. She's teaching classes to corpses. She's engaging in the threshold between what is living and what is not living. And this comprises the majority of her work. And then she switches to working with dogs, because for her, dogs represent pure life. And in Thailand, there's many stray dogs everywhere. And so she started keeping them and making videos about them, about the human relationship to dogs as well. So it was really interesting to think through this artist who is really also coming from Theravada Buddhism, which is the majority religion in Thailand, and working with some of the traditions, but also breaking a lot of taboos in that spiritual tradition in her work. And it was really interesting to see how it was received in New York, because people really latched onto it. Something they maybe never really heard of or thought of. It was also sort of controversial in some way, but I think people really responded to it. And it was sort of interesting to bring in an artist that had been perhaps left out of a very topical conversation around art and theory.
And I think maybe, I don't know if you would want to talk about one of the group shows that you organized at SculptureCentre, which you did several group shows, I think. That last one, Teresa Burga was also fun. Oh, I didn't know you had worked on that one.
Yeah, Teresa Burga's also first solo show in the United States. Again, an art, like taking the plunge, right? Because she's an artist that has been shown, she's art historically significant. What does it mean to do a show like this also in a smaller institution that is flexible and more artist-driven? So this was really an exciting opportunity. So she came for the opening. She's in her 80s, Peruvian artist, worked from the 60s to the present. She had some new drawings in the exhibition. And these hand sculptures were newly shown. So, and then the blocks, the prismas and the platform, those were all from the 60s. Some were reproduced, and the woman was also from the 60s. So it was really exciting to connect this artist to, again, New York has an international art scene, but it's really also very local and provincial in many ways. So artists really responded to this, younger artists, let's say.
And there's something quite interesting about, I mean, just like the breadth of the type of artists that you work with. It seems also quite interesting that it's not necessarily that there's a line between one artist and the other. You're just somehow showcasing in the most, I don't know, it seems like it's a very caring way, the way you present the work of these artists from many, many different regions. And I think that's also quite something that's super important, that not a lot of institutions in the US, I think more and more they're realizing that they have to travel more, do more studio visits, and just get to know more artists from different parts of the world whose sculptural language or whose like kind of visual language might be unlike the one that their eyes are used to seeing. And it seems like this is something that you've somehow championed from the beginning of your career. I think that's, I mean, such an important thing, I think, for curators to really get to know other cultural contexts and keep an eye open of what's kind of happening in these different regions.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. But I think it's really, I think I've always been interested in, just based on my own background and interest in different practices, different contexts, and then working in institutions. The translatability is also a really major concern. And I think this also started for me to be put in practice really working in Miami, because while working in Miami, I showed the Clairefontaine image, but that's like not really so exemplary of everything that I was doing there, because I started a deeper engagement with Latin America through working in that city, which is, as some people say, a hub or a capital of Latin America in terms of the intersections of people that you find there. And coming into Miami, I didn't know anything about. I was very I didn't have any specific personal tie to Latin America, but I started working with artists there through the scene, seeing the shows in the galleries. A lot of Latin American galleries are in Miami, but then I started traveling more to different cities that artists in Miami were from, or their parents were from, or their grandparents were from. And it was actually really eye-opening to see the disjunction between what was represented in Miami of Latin America and then what was going on in different cities and capitals in Latin America. And I think it became really important for me to bring younger artists from different cities in Latin America into Miami and into this context. But then there were things like, you see different materials being used. You see different questions being asked. You see different contexts, like an artist making using a found object and deploying it in a particular way in Bogota is really different than when it's in the U.S. So these were things that were really interesting to me in terms of how to create enough space and context for an artist to be seen in their own right, even if they're being shown somewhere else. So that was something that was really, I think, formative for me in terms of trying to also convince coworkers and directors of certain artists' values when they're relating them to, a canon in their mind. So how do you open that up?
And I think that exhibition is quite representative of that type of work that you've been doing for so long.
Yeah, so Casa Tomada, I co-curated a Site Santa Fe biennial exhibition. So we worked on this show for a couple of years, and it's a small biennial, but it allowed us to be really precise, I think, which was great. We worked very closely together as the curatorial team, which was also really generative. And I think if you also look at the artist list, the Site Santa Fe biennial is a biennial of the Americas. So that's the concept. So that's what we were working with. And we were really thinking of ways to pinpoint certain places, topics, issues. The show opened in 2018. And as we were organizing it, so many things happened, like U.S. elections, migrant issues, the southern border issues. So there's all these things that were coming up in the U.S. at least, and then thinking about that in relation to the rest of the Americas. And we were aware that there was no way for us to possibly take this on, tackle this head on, or ask artists to be responsive to the new political and social conditions that were unfolding, which is what a biennial is, right? It's supposed to be topical. It's supposed to be instructive about what's going on at the moment. And so we were able to, I think, do this in a more open and poetic way by using some of these literary narrative devices, like the Casa Tomada story, which is a Julio Cortázar short story. And we were able to sort of speak more broadly about really specific concerns. And the artist in the image is Tania Perez Cordova, who's an artist based in Mexico City. And it was really interesting, her work in the context of the show and some of the ideas we were pulling out that were more political, because it really emphasized how much her work is about absence and loss and material that speaks of a dissolution. So like this one work is a big slab of mud, and inside of it is lipstick and cigarette butts and human materials that have dissolved into the earth that she's putting upright, standing in front of us. So I think it was really interesting to rethink her work. And Jose, you did an amazing, beautiful show of Tanya's work at the MCA Chicago, which we came to see, which was very important for us in terms of our thinking for this biennial. And some of the works were there. But, it was interesting to think of it. Like, it's interesting how an artist's work changes depending on where it is or what it's in relation to. So that's something that's also really
And it's interesting to see also Jumana Manaz also in that exhibition, I think with a new film that I believe you commissioned specifically for...
We didn't commission, but it was the first time it was shown. Yeah,
okay.
An exhibition.
It's interesting, I think, that these kind of bigger group shows, that it's an opportunity to put in dialogue these artists that have perhaps never even heard of each other, or whose practices, or who don't think that the practice informs the other's practice. But there's so many connections between the works of some of the artists that were within this exhibition that together kind of created this constellation, this very meaningful constellation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because of the install shot, you can't see that Sable Elise Smith is right next to it, and she's a New York-based artist, and it was a video in which it's a meditation, almost a letter from her father who's incarcerated to his daughter. So it's this very moving, but also very abstract narrative about family life in relation to the prison system, being somewhere else, separated literally by an institution like the jail system in the U.S. And then on the other side was Paz Arazaris, a Chilean artist, and there were these really amazing photos she had taken of these women that were working in brothels, and they were with their ID cards. So it was really started, talking about a lot of things emerged from that combination that I think was intentional, but also unexpected in some way, and also different ways of reading those artists' works.
And there was a very brilliant kind of curatorial opening moment in that exhibition, that it was the foot of a former, if you can tell that story, because it was kind of an artwork that was made by the curators almost.
Yeah,
but a very interesting kind of curatorial gesture that kind of frames the exhibition in this kind of very different reading.
Yeah, there's a monument of a conquistador in New Mexico, because the show's in New Mexico, Site Santa Fe, which has a very complex history and contemporary,
to say the least.
Yeah, and current situation. And so there's this conquistador statue who was a monument that was erected in the early 90s, so not an old monument, a new one. And soon after it was erected, an anonymous group came and took off the right foot of this conquistador. And it was this huge scandal because someone had defaced this public monument. It's city property. And that was in 97. So in 2017, as we were working on the show and we were thinking of other issues around monuments that were ongoing, many, as you know, in Charlottesville, there were a lot of complications around monuments. So people negotiating the meaning of these monuments, protests, counter-protests, violence, and then in the New York Times, there was a story where Oñate, the conquistador, his foot reemerged. And there was a story, and you just saw this photo of a foot in a lawn on this grassy surface, and this guy, shadowy guy in a cowboy hat, whose identity we still don't know, who comes out as having taken the foot. And Candace, who lived in New Mexico at the time, she knew this filmmaker who knew the guy at the foot, who was a source for the New York Times story. So we contacted him and asked him if we could get access to the foot. And he gave us access to the foot. We couldn't I saw the foot. I touched it. And it, has this mythic quality now in New Mexico. It's everyone knows the story. And it, creates a divide between the Pueblo native populations and the Hispanic populations in New Mexico because it's a Spanish conquistador. And he was very violent, and he ordered the right foot of all these Acoma Pueblo men to be cut off, allegedly, but it's probably true, in some skirmish. So this was like a monument to this really brutal conquistador, and that's why the right foot was taken off, because he had ordered the right foot to be removed. So we got the foot, and we made a mold of it, and then we cast a dirt clay foot that was on display in the exhibition, really as almost as like a didactic material, like this is evidence of something. We put a part of the mold next to like an info display area so that you could see this was really made after the foot. And it was a really interesting way to tie it back into the local, while we also have all these international artists from, native artists, artists from Canada, Argentina, all over the Americas. For the most part, we couldn't hit every place, but we tried in some way. But yeah, it was a really interesting exercise and project, and we had also engaged with the local communities, and we had to talk to everybody to get the permission and let them know that we were doing this.
Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic kind of way to open the show and to provide this kind of other reading to the exhibition. And it's always interesting to see how these kind of long 2-year projects somehow always have to react to whatever is happening in the world, right? Very specifically, this spoke about the local context, but it connected to many kind of much broader things that were happening around the world. I think that maybe in the interest of time, you can maybe speak a little bit about this exhibition, which I mentioned in my introduction. That was a fantastic exhibition co-curated with an artist, and there's also something interesting of as a curator working in an institution, collaborating with an artist to curate an exhibition. And I think this speaks very interestingly about that, but maybe briefly also about your work at PS1, so that we have a couple of minutes to open up to questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, I'll recap the last year really quickly, but it's quite busy. So 74 million tons. So this was a show I co-created with Lawrence Abu Hamdan, and the artists in this show are investigating. Really, we're looking at artworks that worked as evidence. So artists that intervened into spaces or created or explored or experimented with material that then actually had use value outside of the realm of art. So these were things that, were at the forefront of different technologies. Susan Shupley, a Canadian artist, made a really deep research into, Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill, Exxon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, she was visualizing things that people had not visualized before. So she was taking things that already existed plus her new image making, and in fact was creating new layers of meaning, new layers of interpreting this event, because all these different corporations and NGOs that created images weren't talking to each other. So as an artist, actually bringing together all this material to generate new evidence. So that was really a primary organizing principle of the show. There's every work in the show has a 20-minute long story behind it, so I won't get into it. But it was also really immediate too. That's something we really wanted to, get into with the show, is that it doesn't have to be a didactic research-based practice. Doesn't have to be text on a wall describing what happened. So that was also a mode of our organizing in the exhibition. And then things that I've done at PS1 since I started in last year. so I started and quickly organized a couple shows and have some more coming up. But an artist that I actually had wanted to do a show with at SculptureCentre when I was there, Fernando Palma Rodríguez, who is another artist based in Mexico, and he this was his first time showing his sculptures in the U.S. So we had a grouping of works, his like robotic, mechanic sculptures in the gallery, which was also really amazing for viewers to see, and also like quite a feat. But this was, I think, a really important show for him, but also for me, because it was really amazing to learn more about the work that he's doing through organizing this show, because Fernando's an artist, but also an activist. He's an engineer, so it was really interesting. And then Julia Phillips is another show that I organized at the same time, an artist who's working with sculpture as well. Mostly ceramics that are molded to the body, and then create these new scenarios in which the body engages with these objects and potential positions or scenarios that are quite psychological. And then coming up, I'll just highlight two shows that I'm working on right now, opening in March. Caribbean Collective, a group of indigenous filmmakers in Australia who shoot videos on their phones and I think they have one video camera, and make these really amazing narratives, winding together and weaving together ancestral traditional stories with contemporary concerns such as land disputes, toxicity, governmental control over their lives, so different aspects like that. So that's their first show in the U.S. I was just there in Australia last month to see them. And then Simone Fatal, which I'm very excited about, and this is a retrospective of the Syrian, Lebanese, American, I think that's it, artist who is in her 70s, and she makes a lot of these really amazing ceramic sculptures, porcelain, bronze, and paintings. So we're showing works from the late 69 to the present. And like this one image on the right is called A House in Damascus. So they all have these really amazing narratives behind the works. This is a wounded warrior on the other side. So she's mining history, archaeology, ancient epic tales such as Gilgamesh, the Bible, and to come up with these really evocative narratives.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think I mean, I'm always fascinated by your kind of like really long exhibition history, and many of the artists that you've worked with are always artists that, I wish I would have done that show. So it's kind of like, I really admire your work, and I think it's fantastic what you're doing, what you've done at SculptureCentre and what you're doing now at PS1. PS1 is such a kind of like an iconic organization. It has such a fascinating institutional history that was almost like part of this kind of movement of independent spaces that were founded in the 70s in New York City, in an old school. And it somehow, even though the world has changed so much from then and now, it somehow still manages to keep that kind of independent spirit. And even though the world not necessarily has grown, but like our knowledge of artists from other places is so different from the knowledge that back in the day working curators in the 70s had. We just have much more access, or at least we're privileged enough to have access to artists in other contexts, from Australia to Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you've managed to kind of navigate this very, very big world in a very caring way. It feels like it seems like that your relationship with artists is always visible in the exhibitions that you do, and I think that's one of the most important things, at least in the way I see the type of work that I do, which is also organizing exhibitions, but it's establishing these kind of like long-term relationships with artists that are, it's much more, it's beyond the exhibition at the institution where we work. It's kind of like following their careers and maintaining a relationship and really understanding, like getting to know them on an artistic and personal level. There's really kind of like no distinction between those two things. And maybe I think we'll have to cut this right at 5 from what I was told. So I think we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience, if there's any.
Hello. Hi, Ruba. I was curious, as a curator, I really admire your international scope. I think you really introduced a lot of artists throughout your career, you've introduced a lot of artists to communities, to museums. So I was really curious about your process, whether you have sort of a portfolio of artists that you've been watching for a while, you're visiting biennials, but I really do feel you have such a broad scope that I'm just curious, where do you start from? Where does one begin?
Thank you. I do have a running list in my phone. And after so long, but I look at it periodically and I have to say, I have moments where I look at it and I'm like, wow, I did it. Like they're on the list and sometimes they're there for years. Some will maybe never happen, but I don't really know why that is, but it's sort of a strange feeling to be like, okay, working through this. But yeah, I see shows, I travel around, I talk to other artists too. I think like when I'm working with artists, it's interesting because artists also bring up other artists. But I think it's also, I think about audience too, actually, and that helps me think about artists. So it's, I'm always thinking about artists and following careers, but I'm also thinking of the moment and the context and maybe what makes sense or what is needed. So I think that's something that really drives me as to timing and why we would do something or why I would do a show right now or of this artist and what that means. So I think that helps actually define the playing field a little bit, because there are so many amazing artists that it's, you could just do a show of anyone really. So it's like, yeah, that's definitely, I think, some of the thought process behind it, and just having worked in a couple different institutions, different scales, different cities, I think that, as everyone, people that do that, you have to think a little bit differently. Things don't work in one place if they would work in another.
So it seems like you did a lot of shows at SculptureCentre. Like at the MCA Chicago, which is where I used to work before, I think it was like one show every year and a half. It seems like you were doing like 4 or 5 shows a year.
That is true, but it's a small space, a small team. So that's where I really come from, is like fast. You have to do it yourself. You don't have so much help. A little bit, and at SculptureCentre, we were doing a lot of exhibitions and trying to split up the space and trying to bring lots of artists, because it's a small space. We wanted to bring in a lot of artists in the year. That was something that we cared about. We didn't want to just do 3 shows a year, have 3 artists a year. We wanted to bring in a lot of artists into the exhibition program. But at PS1, what's really amazing is it's a bigger space. There's multiple floors, multiple spaces, multiple shows. I think in the spring we're opening 9. March, like those 2 shows I showed you are 2 of 9 exhibitions, and we're also a very small team, so we're really in it. So it's great because we can be really responsive and plan things on a longer timeline, but just actually put something together really fast too, depending on the scale of the space within the building. And I think that allows us to maintain a sort of freshness. But yeah, it's interesting having those multiple wheels going at once, where you're thinking of something 2 or 3 years out, but also something that's just next month.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Sí.
I wanted to ask how the Fernando Palma Rodríguez show was received in New York.
That show was really exciting because of many reasons, but one reason was because of the really great reception that it received. Fernando was in New York for a little bit of time installing the show. He spoke to a lot of press. He got a lot of press. People were really interested in his story and his work, what he was saying as a person, but also through the exhibition. And it was extremely rewarding that people were very interested and engaged and curious about what he was doing. And I think it was truly unlike anything that people had seen or knew that they had seen. It was very, I think Fernando has a very specific practice that comes out of very his training and his experience, but I think it was really inspiring for a lot of people to see his work.
Well, with that, I think I just want to thank Ruba for spending a few days with us here in Mexico City, and I hope you get a chance to see the fair. And thank you for sharing your work with the audience, and thank you all for coming as well. Gracias.